From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. The 7 O'Clock Club is the debut novel of author Amelia Ireland. And when I say this book is unforgettable, I am not exaggerating. It is about life, love, and grief. However, there is a plot twist that I will tell you, I think will not only astonish you, but it is going to keep you thinking about this book for quite a while after, because, well, I'm at least still thinking about it after having read it. And we are lucky enough to have Amelia joining us today to talk more. Amelia, really nice to have you on the program.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
So give us a brief synopsis of the book.
Okay. So it's set in a group bereavement counselling session, and it's told from the perspective of 4 different characters, Victoria, Freya, Misha, and Callum. And the underlying premise is that it tracks the stages of grief, essentially. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And the overarching plot is that you have the 4 characters arrive at 7 o'clock, the idea being that they will have 4 sessions, but the counsellor suggests that she's got an alternative method of helping them to navigate the grief process. And all you really know at the start is that something very traumatic happened to each of those characters about 6 months earlier. They're very reluctant about being there, and they really don't want to talk about the events which brought them to the room. As the story develops, you get to know more about them as characters. You start to find out a little bit about what happened to them. And then about 2/3 of the way through the book, there is a twist, which is what people are most keen on. And that sends the plot in a very different direction. And I guess all I will say is that you realise that those characters have been brought into that room for a reason, and their stories are much more intertwined than perhaps you realised at the start.
Mm-hmm. And we really cannot talk about the twist because it will honestly give the whole book away. However, I am so curious about how you came up with the idea for the book.
The original, I guess, idea came to me. I was watching a film on a flight, on a work flight, and it was called Collateral Beauty, which is a Will Smith film, and it's fairly old now, but it's about an advertising executive who sadly loses his daughter at a young age and just finds it impossible to get over her death. And I found it a very moving film. It's quite unusual in terms of the plot itself, but I just remember thinking that I wanted to write something similar in the sense that I'd also had an experience of bereavement myself, as had a couple of my friends. Different stories, different reasons. But it occurred to me that people tackle grief in very, very different ways. So I became interested in writing something where you had a very diverse group of people, different social backgrounds, different professions, different ages, different genders, and they're all brought into the same space, and they have to try and process what's happened to them. So I sort of started writing in that vein initially. Actually had 3 characters, not 4, at the very beginning. And then I guess I thought that I didn't want the whole ethos of the book to be about something sad. And I could have sort of proceeded along and made the outcome of the story, finding out what had happened to each of them. But I wanted to do something a bit different. But then I also wanted to make it a hopeful and uplifting story in itself. I didn't want to leave people sad. So that sort of resulted in me thinking about the twist itself and how I might craft that, but also how I can have an ending which is hopefully something that gives people some degree of hope.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned you had your own experience with grief. And if you don't mind, if we could talk a little bit about your mom, because the character of Misha in the book, she's young. Her mother has Alzheimer's, and this has really impacted her. And you had a similar experience with your mom. So how much did that play into wanting a character who struggles like Misha does with this?
I think I mean it was in terms of the stories that Misha tells about her mother, they came from direct personal experiences. And I guess I wanted a way of processing what had happened to me. Um, I have to say, I didn't have the same burdens that Misha had in terms of caring because my father was alive, is alive, and took the brunt of that, I would have to say, himself. But I was always so admiring of the fact that he did that and how difficult a journey it was for him to actually have someone that he cared about so deeply deteriorate in that manner. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I wanted to then put those stories into the character of a young female because I knew from my own perspective how it felt from a mother-daughter relationship as well. So I guess it was sort of a combination of a tribute to remembering my mum, helping people to sort of understand the burden of caring for someone with Alzheimer's, but then also talking about the mother-daughter relationship as well.
Mm. Oh, what about the character of Colum? Why did you decide to make him this world famous musician? I mean, because as you're reading, I'm kind of like, what? And he's going to, because first off, I thought, really? They're making him
Yeah.
go to a therapy group? Like, but it really does work in the book. But it was
Yeah.
fascinating.
I mean, that's actually a really good question. So he was the character that didn't exist at all when I started writing the book.
Oh,
So I had three female characters.
uh-huh.
And it just felt a little bit like it wasn't taking off. Um, and then I also became intrigued by the idea of how men process grief. And it is
Mm,
often in a very different way to women because they're a little bit more closed in traditionally in how they process their emotions. So I thought I would like to introduce a male character. Um, it coincided with I guess, a friendship that I had with someone who was a musician. And he was going through rehab for drug addiction.
mm-hmm,
And we'd been talking a lot about what he'd experienced. And I think it gave me the idea that what about if I had a character who is not only grieving and male, from a creative background where you've suffered with addictions, which would impact how you process grief. But then also, if on top of all that, you were in the public eye, um, because that creates a whole different burden that no one else can possibly experience unless they've been through it.
mm-hmm.
So I asked my friend if he would be happy for me to interview him, and we did a series of interviews over about 3 to 6 months. And although he's not a sort of world famous musician, he did give a lot of insight into sort of being in the public eye and that perception that people have of you and how everything you do gets scrutinized and judged, and you become a sort of character that people can invent and decide what happens to you. So I think it was all of those factors combined that just created Callum.
Well, and I really appreciated really how you put the book together as these therapy sessions, right? For people who are grieving. I myself have experienced something like that when my dad passed away 20 plus years ago. And I went to a grief support group and it really took me back, but it also reminded me of the hope it gave me in that
Mm-hmm.
group because you do realize that maybe someone hasn't experienced the same grief, right? Maybe they haven't lost a parent, maybe they've lost a spouse, maybe they've lost a friend, but grief can be so isolating, right?
Yeah.
If we don't find an outlet for it. So as you were writing and you were deciding to put it really the majority of the book within these group sessions, were you thinking about that and trying to find, ways to make grief not so isolating?
Yeah, for sure. I think I've always known that talking with people helps you process things, and that's
Hmm.
always what I've found the most beneficial thing of having close friends that I can share things with that I get from one thought process to another through talking and having opinions, and I guess just the benefit of having that kind of environment. And but at the same time, I guess I also wanted them to be strangers, because I think sometimes when you're wanting to talk about things that are difficult subjects, or you
Mm-hmm.
know that your family or friends already have an opinion, um, that whatever you say is going to be sort of tainted with what they think, that there's a certain attraction to just going somewhere and sharing your raw emotions with a group of people that don't know you, um, and don't judge you because they're going through their own issues themselves. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I think it was sort of that essence of being able to share, but being able to share with people who don't know you combined, that made me want to put everything into that environment.
I thought what else was interesting was the character of Victoria, because you know
Mm-hmm.
you with her character. I mean, I'm reading it and I'm thinking, okay, what kind of grief is she processing, right? Where does she fit into this group? Because so much of her grief seems to come from her childhood, and
Mm-hmm.
her parents not being there for her in the way that she had hoped they would be. And again, talk a little bit about that, because I think it's a type of grief, again, that we don't necessarily talk about, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, okay, well, we assume grief means death, and sometimes it doesn't.
Mm. No, definitely. And I mean, I went to boarding school, so I've got experience of people from that world where you don't necessarily get raised in that much of an affectionate, loving environment.
Hmm.
And yeah, and I think there's definitely a lot of resentment that builds up with people who then grow up. And we now exist in a world where everyone's talking about their feelings, where therapy is such an acceptable thing to do and often encouraged. And people from that generation before still struggle because they come from an environment and a world that was totally different, even though, relatively speaking, it wasn't that long ago. So I wanted to have her as a character to sort of show a different generational aspect where you're really grieving a life that you wish you'd had but missed out on, and then it results in your whole adulthood almost being tainted by what went before.
Hmm. I so wish we could talk about the plot twist, but we cannot. You have to read the book. But with that said, you mentioned that I mean, I know we've talked a lot about grief, and I know you said you didn't want to leave people, sad. And I will say that the book didn't leave me sad. It left me thinking, but in a really positive way. And it makes me want to go back and reread the book now that I know the ending, which
Yeah.
I very rarely reread books, but I want to. But before I let you go, what do you hope readers take away when they put this book down, and they've taken a moment to soak it all in once they know what the plot twist is?
I guess so many things. I think, like you say, that if a book stays with you for long after you finished it, that's such an achievement for an author. So that was probably a huge goal, because I think there are books that are great books and they're stories and you finish them and you're done and then you move on to the next one. So I think having that
Mm-hmm.
lasting impression is amazing and something that I could have only wished for. Um, then stimulating people's imagination, because the twist, I guess, is unusual. And I tried, even though it was unusual, to make it as realistic as possible, despite the fact it is fairly far-fetched. And I spent a lot of time crafting explanations for why everything was as it was. So there's sort of a lot of background material which didn't make it into the book, where I thought of an answer for every possible question that people
Mm.
might raise. So I guess sort of having a reader have those questions and process answers to them themselves or have them answered by the book, that would be a great takeaway for me. And then I think lastly, if anyone reads it who is going through something difficult themselves or has had something sad or traumatic happen to them for which they're grieving, to actually get some comfort from it and to see that actually talking through your feelings, whether it be with friends or family or in a more formal therapy session, that can only really have benefits.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking time to talk to us. This book is still with me, and thank you so much for talking to us today. I really appreciate the conversation.
No, it's great talking to you. Thank you very much for having me.
We've been talking with author Amelia Ireland. Her debut novel, The 7 O'Clock Club, is out now. This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudette.